Good morning. I'm Bonnie Gardner. I'm co-chair of the Public Affairs Forum of the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Austin. We're located at 4700 Grover Avenue. Our forums are free and open to the public and occur most Sundays at noon. We encourage you to attend. For more information on our forums, you can go to our church website at www.austinuu.org. And now I want to let Judy Sadek introduce today's speaker. And Judy is a longtime forum committee member and responsible for getting a lot of our great speakers. Judy?
Thank you, Bonnie. I'm also on the Social Action Committee, so I try to find things that make a connection there. It's my great pleasure to introduce Bob Libal today. Bob is the Executive Director of Grassroots Leadership. He has worked more than a decade on issues of prison privatization and especially immigrant detention. You may remember several years ago that some of us went up to the Hutto prison in Taylor when that was a family prison, and Grassroots Leadership and Bob were very involved in that, and it was shut down as a family prison. It's now a prison for women immigrants. And some of our members have been involved in a program that Bob has, I think, probably directs or is very involved in, visiting the women up there. And they go up there once a month or more. Bob is co-author or author of many reports and articles and serves as the chair of a national detention watch network. He's regularly interviewed by national, regional, and local press as an expert on prison privatization, immigration detention, immigration enforcement policies, and the business of prisons. We are truly lucky to have him working in our community and sharing with us this morning.
Thank you, Judy, and thanks everybody for being here, and thanks to First UU for hosting these events. 51 years of consecutive public affairs forums, that's pretty impressive. And, I think that First UU and the Unitarian churches in Austin generally are amongst those that we can always count on to be a part of social justice movements, and particularly in the last couple of years, the growing movement for immigrant justice and to stop the deportations that have become such a defining part of the immigrant experience in the United States and here in Travis County as well, unfortunately. I think the last time I was here is when you all hosted the UndocuBus, the bus of undocumented riders riding from Phoenix all the way to D.C., I believe. And I live right around the corner, and so it's always a pleasure to be here. So thanks for having me. So I work at Grassroots Leadership. Grassroots Leadership is a 33-year-old southern and southwestern-based national social justice organization that was founded by a gentleman named Cy Khan, who was a civil rights organizer who went south in the mid-'60s to work with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and founded Grassroots Leadership in 1980 to help build a Southern social justice movement across the lines that so often divided Southern social justice movements, so principally race, class, gender, and sexual orientation. And Grassroots Leadership was really instrumental in building several progressive organizations in the South, and in particular in the Southeast, throughout our early history. In the 1990s, we started a campaign called the Public Assets Campaign to look at the privatization of public resources. And so we started looking at how privatization was impacting many of the communities we were working in across issue areas. So the privatization of health care, the privatization of electric and other utilities, and then the privatization of the criminal justice system. And it was that third piece, the privatization of prisons, jails, and immigrant detention centers, that really resonated with so many of the communities that we work in, particularly African American communities, which in the 1990s were on the front lines of the devastation being caused by the war on drugs and the rise of mass incarceration in the United States. And so today what I want to talk about, and what's been one of the focal points of our work in the last several years, is the rise of an immigration detention system in the United States. And that's a very depressing topic. There's going to be lots of stats, lots of stories that are very depressing. But I also want to talk about some of the inspiring strategies to challenge that very depressing system of detention and deportation. And so we're going to do the depressing stuff first, and then kind of get to the really inspiring movements at the end. I think that it's impossible to talk about the rise of detention and deportation in the United States without talking about mass incarceration and the prison system in the United States. As people may know, the United States incarcerates more people and a higher percentage of our population than any country in the history of the world. We have 2.3 million people who are behind bars, whether they're incarcerated in federal or state prisons or in local jails or immigration detention facilities. And we have about 5% of the world's total population, but about 25% of the world's incarcerated population, meaning on average, we incarcerate people at a rate of about 5 times the rest of the world. And you can see by this graph, which comes to us from the from the Justice Policy Institute, that it hasn't always been this way, right? That the rise of imprisoning people at the rate in which we do in the United States really came about in the late 70s and early 80s with the rise of the drug war. And in particular, policies like mandatory minimum sentences, 3 strikes you're out laws that say that you go to prison for extended periods of time, and other sorts of sentencing enhancement laws, things like truth in sentencing, which say you have to serve the full amount of your sentence, or 85 or 90% of your sentence, rather than being eligible for parole early. And the combination of these laws really has resulted in the dramatic increase, right, particularly in the 80s and 90s, in the number of people incarcerated. And as I'm sure people in this congregation know, this is not an equal access program. This is not something that has impacted communities similarly. African Americans are 6 times more likely to be incarcerated than white folks in the United States. And despite similar drug patterns, African Americans are dramatically more likely to be incarcerated for simple drug possession or drug distribution than white people, even though the usage and distribution of drugs across race lines is relatively equal. And it's in this context that came the birth of the private prison industry. And I'll talk specifically about Corrections Corporation of America because it was almost 30 years ago right now. It was 30 years ago, 1984, Super Bowl weekend, that Corrections Corporation of America opened its first immigration detention facility, the Houston Processing Center, near the airport in Houston, Texas. CCA was founded a year earlier in 1983 with investment money, with seed money provided by the same group of investors that started Hospital Corporation of America, one of the largest managed health organizations, and the same group of investors that founded Kentucky Fried Chicken. So it's an investment group that created 3 Fortune 500 companies. CCA, one of CCA's co-founders was a gentleman named Tom Beasley, and he sort of infamously now has said that prisons could be sold just like you were selling cars or real estate or hamburgers. And since the company's founding in 1983, we've seen this massive growth in prisons and immigration detention centers in the United States. And it's birthed an industry of for-profit prison corporations. So in addition to Corrections Corporation of America, you also have the GEO Group, Combined, CCA and Geo Group, which are the two publicly traded corporations, so you can buy and sell their stocks on the New York Stock Exchange. Combined, these two companies now have annual revenues of more than $3 billion. They operate hundreds of thousands of prison beds in the United States and abroad. The Geo Group has expanded its operations to the UK, to Australia, to South Africa. And there are also smaller companies like Management and Training Corporation, which is a Utah-based privately held company, and community education centers. I think that Management and Training Corporation and community education centers compete for the most Orwellian of for-profit prison names, right? One would not think that a company called Community Education Centers would be actually in the business of operating privately operated prisons and immigration detention centers, but in fact, that is the majority of their business. CEC, you may have read about in a series of front-page New York Times articles last year because of the company's disastrous operations of the New Jersey halfway house system, including their very close connections to Governor Chris Christie. Actually, their website featured a video of Chris Christie endorsing their halfway house system before the New York Times exposed what was going on in the facilities. CEC also operates, and some people in the room have been to the Polk County Detention Center and Immigration Detention Center that folks from Grassroots Leadership and Texans United for Families have visited several times over the last couple of years, that is amongst the nation's worst immigration detention facilities. So what are some of the problems with private prison corporations, right? Why is this actually a troubling trend versus the nation's massive public prison system? And certainly, we are in no way advocates for our nation's public system. Our public prison system has a myriad of problems, and yet there are some institutional pressures with private prisons that tend to make them even worse than publicly operated prisons. The way that a private prison corporation makes its money is that it's usually paid a per diem rate, right? So a per prisoner, per day rate, a bed rate. And the way they make their profits is that they turn around and spend substantially less of that government money on the facility. And the biggest way that they can cut costs is by dramatically lower pay and benefits for rank-and-file staff who work in the facilities. That can lead to extremely high turnover rates. In 2009, the Texas Senate Criminal Justice Committee had an interim charge to study how it was overseeing private prisons. And one of the things that it asked was, what are the turnover rates in public facilities versus private facilities? In publicly operated prisons, the turnover rates were 24%, which is actually really high for an institution like a prison. Part of the reason for that is because a lot of our prisons in the state of Texas are in areas that have become prime for fracking, right? So actually Karn City is a big detention center magnet. So it's very difficult to get people to work in prisons when the starting salary for a TDCJ correctional officer is $27,000 a year, and you can go work in a fracking field starting at $35,000 or $40,000 a year. So it's difficult to staff public prisons. But private prisons had a 90% annual turnover rate in 2009. Now imagine staffing any institution, right? Whether, I can't imagine staffing my nonprofit on a 90% annual turnover rate. But to staff something as volatile as a prison facility with constant turnover is something that creates higher rates of violence, right? So studies have shown that there's higher volatility, there's higher rates of violence in for-profit prisons. And there's also lower rates of programming and higher recidivism rates that come out of these facilities. But perhaps the biggest problem, right, and Grassroots Leadership, we have a moral objection to the idea that corporations are making billions of dollars off of a system of incarceration, right? We don't believe that people should profit from the incarceration of human beings. But perhaps the biggest problem with this system is that it incentivizes incarceration, Private prison corporations like Corrections Corporation of America and the GEO Group principally spend millions of dollars every year lobbying federally, at the state level, and at local levels to ensure their interests are met. And their interests are very clearly to have more and more people who are incarcerated. And in fact, in their SEC filings, they say things like they have to outline for their investors what some of the threats to their industry are. And some of the threats that they have to outline in these documents are a liberalization of drug laws, right? A reduction in the number of people who are incarcerated and detained. And so to meet those, in order to make sure that they have expanding profits, one of the things that they do is they write contracts in a way so that there are guarantees for the number of people that will be incarcerated in their facilities. This came out a couple of years ago when Corrections Corporation of America wrote a letter to 48 governors around the country saying that they would offer to buy prison facilities. This was in 2010, so it was during the height of the recession when states were very cash-strapped. They would offer to buy prisons for cash, right, from states. But the catch was they wanted long-term contracts where the state would lease that prison back, 20-year contracts in a lot of cases, and a guarantee that those facilities would be 90% full. And this was at a time when there's been steadily decreasing crime rates around the country, when actually states are starting to close prison facilities. And so, that clearly is an incentive to keep facilities open, to keep them full, even at a time when many states are considering closing prison facilities. And in fact, Texas has closed 3 prison facilities in the last 2 legislative sessions. Another area where private prison corporations have exercised influence is through their membership in the American Legislative Exchange Council. Both major companies have since stepped down from that council, but both also served as, or Corrections Corporation of America also served as the chair of the Criminal Justice Committee of the American Legislative Exchange Council, in a position to help draft model legislation for states around the country. And in fact, it was at a meeting of the American Legislative Exchange Council that NPR reported that Corrections Corporation of America was in the room as state legislators drafted what would become Arizona's SB 1070, the harshest anti-immigration law passed at the time. Which leads us to the issue of immigration and how private prison corporations are profiting off of the detention and deportation of immigrants. And I think here I'll show a video, but one thing to note, I think, our country has a system of civil immigration detention, right? We have, outside of our criminal justice system, this is the only place where someone can have their liberty taken for a civil violation, right? The immigration court system is not a criminal court system. If you are in immigration court, you are not guaranteed a lawyer, right? In fact, almost everyone in immigration detention doesn't have a personal attorney. And yet we have tens of thousands of people, 34,000 people every day in this country whose liberty is deprived simply because of their immigration status. And I could talk about it, but there's a 2-minute video that explains it perfectly, so we'll do that. And this is a video from a group called Civic, which Grassroots leadership in the Hutto Visitation Program, which we'll talk about a little bit at the end, is a part of.
Our people and our children are not for sale.
Every year, over 400,000 people disappear and are bought and sold in the United States.
It's scary, really scary. Well, it's like a really bad nightmare. I want to wake up already. It's like I can't help anymore. I'm missing all my hair, all my teeth, everything. It's like you're alone.
3 major corporations lobby the U.S. government to guarantee their own profit.
We be locked up for 18, 19 hours a day.
Well, they wake us up at 4 in the morning, like the same routine every day. And, most of the time we're just in the room.
This happens every day on American soil. It's called immigration detention. And it's the law. Congress mandates how many immigrants must be locked up at all times. 34,000.
This is an unprecedented mandate for law enforcement, as no other law enforcement agencies have a quota for the number of people that they must keep in jail.
People are traded between for-profit prisons like commodities, isolating them from their families and communities. The Obama administration has detained more people than any other administration in history, and you are paying for it. $5 billion taxpayer dollars per year.
It's like really frustrating to be in jail and not knowing nothing about your kids and family.
We're very scared. We're very worried because, you know, we don't have a way for connect with another person.
I would like the people to help, you know, to listen to us. We're human. We deserve, you know, to be with our kids, our family, because they're the ones suffering right now. I would like to be with my babies and show them that there's another way in life. I'm praying for another opportunity.
You and I, as citizens, have the obligation to shape the debates of our time, not only with the votes we cast, but with the voices we lift in defense of our most ancient values and enduring ideals.
So I think the video does a fairly good job of explaining the bed quota, right? And this really outlandish, right, idea that we have a quota for the number of people that we detain. I think one thing to note, right, is that a lot of people think that everyone who's in immigration detention is somebody who's just crossed the border, right? And there's certainly a fair share of that 34,000 people are people who have crossed the border into the United States and therefore are detained because of that. Everyone in detention is fighting to stay in the country, right? If you're not fighting to stay in the country, you're deported within a matter of days, or you get voluntary departure, which it means it's basically you are admitting that you're wrongfully in the country and are accepting departure, so it's less than a deportation. But amongst that 34,000 people, there's actually a very diverse group of people who are detained. So for instance, there's a large portion of the detained population that are asylum seekers in the United States. And they might be asylum seekers who were apprehended crossing the border into the United States, or they could be people who showed up at the border or at an airport and said, I'm seeking asylum in the United States. So several folks from this congregation, including Peggy, are regular visitors to the Tidon Hutto Detention Center. All 512 people who are detained in that facility, all 512 women, are seeking asylum in the United States because they fear persecution if they're returned to their country of origin. They also include longtime residents of the United States, people who are detained in the U.S., people whose status has become irregular for one reason or another. There are estimated between 11 and 12 million undocumented people in the United States, tens of thousands of undocumented people living here in Travis County. A large portion of the people who are being detained today are people who were undocumented and were arrested and apprehended through a program called Secure Communities that runs your fingerprints if you're booked into any jail in the country. And even if you've been arrested on something very minor, like driving without a license or public intoxication or another, low-level crime, and more than 70% of people who are apprehended in this program have been arrested for a very low-level crime or have no criminal history at all. They also include dreamers, right? People who are eligible for the DREAM Act who end up in deportation proceedings. And one of the good things that the Obama administration has done is DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, which gives people an affirmative ability to stay in the country on a temporary work permit if they came as a child. It also includes, the detained population also includes a large portion of legal permanent residents, right? People who hold green cards or other legal status in the country. And I think that that's something that's largely not understood, that going back to 1996 and a couple of immigration laws that were passed in 1996 in the wake of the Oklahoma City bombing, these bills were drafted when there was still speculation that it was an immigrant an Arab who had committed the Oklahoma City bombings, and these bills that included very punitive immigration laws were included in the drafting of the response legislation. Going back to 1996, there's a presumption, right, that you will be detained and deported, and that there's an expanded mandatorily detained population. So as an example, and you'll see a video of them later, our friends Hope and Naz from Houston and Waco before that. Naz was a permanent legal resident. It came as an adult came as a child with his parents. Naz pled guilty to a drug crime because he got probation, right? And his lawyer recommended that he plead guilty. Didn't know the immigration consequences to it. Did everything that you would want somebody who had been involved with the criminal justice system to do, right? Cleaned up his life, became an amazing community volunteer in Waco, started working with an organization that was a mission and service organization to homeless people in Waco, married a young social worker named Hope, who was a social work student at Baylor. They got married under the bridge where the mission was, and a few months after they were married, immigration came to their door at 7:30 in the morning and took Naz away. And he spent, I think, 10 or 11 months in an immigration detention center fighting to stay in the country for a crime that he never did any time in prison for. And this was a for-profit facility down south of San Antonio. Naz probably would have been deported under the current laws had Hope not waged an incredible campaign to keep him in the country. So this practice of detaining 34,000 people every day has proliferated the number of immigration detention centers around the country. There are more than 200 facilities that detain immigrants, from very large facilities, and some of the very largest are here in Texas, to small county jails in places like northern Michigan or Minnesota. And you can also see here that the number of deportations has spiked. This graph only goes through 2010, but in 2011 and 2012, for the first time in history, we deported more than 400,000 people. In April, we will be reaching the mark in which the Obama administration will have deported its 2 millionth person. So that's a fairly shameful statistic. So I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because I know we've already talked a lot about the depressing stuff. But in addition to the civil immigration detention system, we've also started explicitly criminalizing migration through a program called Operation Streamline, which shifts immigration from the civil immigration system, that 34,000 people who are detained in civil immigration, to the criminal justice system, the federal criminal justice system. So if you are an immigrant who has crossed the border without authorization, instead of being dealt with in that civil immigration system, you can now be prosecuted under one of two crimes. 8 U.S. Code 1325, which is a misdemeanor, which is unauthorized entry into the country, or 8 U.S. Code 1326, which is illegal re-entry into the country, which is a felony punishable by up to 20 years in federal prison. These are now the two most prosecuted crimes in the entire federal criminal justice system, by far. It's not even close. And together, last year there were more than 80,000 people prosecuted for those crimes, including nearly 50,000 people prosecuted for the misdemeanor, and on average those people spent 30 days in jail, and almost 40,000 people, in the high 30,000s, of people prosecuted for coming back to the country after being deported. They get a felony conviction, and they serve, on average, more than a year in federal prison for this crime. Now, this is happening at the same time that the Obama administration, thankfully, right, and where states across the country are starting to reconsider the use of very punitive drug sentences and starting to implement some sort of discretion when it comes to which drug offenses they want to prosecute. Right? The Attorney General has issued new guidance to say that we're not going to do federal prosecutions of low-level drug offenders anymore. At the same time, the federal prison population continues to spike, even at the same time that state prison populations are largely declining because of this, because we've put on top of our war on drugs a criminalization regime of immigrants that is increasing the number of people who enter federal prison because of immigration violations. And on top of that, all of the private prisons within the federal immigration system are designated. They're called criminal alien requirement facilities, and they're designated where they segregate immigrant prisoners within the Bureau of Prisons and prisoners from Washington, D.C. into these privately operated facilities where they have far fewer services, far fewer classes, far worse medical care, because the government has said we don't have a responsibility to rehabilitate these people because we're going to deport them once they're done with their sentence anyways. And so the consequences are we're spending more than $1 billion a year on these prisons. Latinos are now over 50% of individuals who are entering the federal prison system. We're seeing a demographic shift within the federal prison system because of these prosecutions. At the same time, private prison profits are through the roof over the last 10 years, largely because of immigration detention and immigration incarceration. And the companies aren't shy about this, right? They say in their annual reports, we have been successful in increasing the number of residents, and they say residents, so at Hutto, for instance, right, they don't call Hutto a detention center, and they don't call the people who are detained there detainees. They call them residents, and they call them a residential facility. So we have been successful in increasing the number of residents in our care and continue to pursue a number of initiatives intended to further increase our occupancy and revenue. From CCA. And George Zoli, the chairman, founder, and CEO of the GEO Group, says the main driver for the growth of new beds at the federal level continues to be the detention and incarceration of criminal aliens. So they're not shy about it. So I often say that this seems like a dystopic science fiction novel, right, where you have people in boardrooms figuring out ways that they can make even more profit off of the detention and incarceration of people from other places, right? Thankfully, I do think that, and I've been working at Grassroots Leadership for 10 years, and I was doing work around private prisons as a student at the University of Texas before that. I think that at no other time in the time that I've been doing this do I actually feel more hopeful that things are going to change than right now. And so I want to talk a little bit about some of the strategies that people are using to try to combat this system of detention and deportation. So one of them is to focus on individual detention facilities, right, and highlight the problems with individual detention centers and therefore highlight the broader issues related to detention and deportation policies. So I think a great example of this is the T-Don Hutto Detention Center in Williamson County, which is a Corrections Corporation of America owned and operated facility that was reopened in 2006 as a new kind of immigration detention facility designed to detain immigrant families, including small children. So when Hutto opened in 2006, it had 500 families in it, 500 people in family units, mostly women and their children, but some men as well. They were asylum seekers from around the world, so people from all over the world. There were people from more than 50 countries were detained at Hutto while it was a family detention facility. It was very much a prison-like facility. There was razor wire around the outside of the facility when it opened. Everyone, including little children, wore prison scrubs. There was cell counts 5 times a day, right? So little kids had to wake up at 5 or 6 in the morning to be counted, right? It was prison-like. There was 1 hour of education when the facility opened that was not in the languages that the children spoke. And in 2006, a friend of mine, Francis Valdez, who was working for Barbara Hines at the time at the University of Texas Law Clinic, came to me and said, we have to do something about this. We can't even get the media to drive out to Taylor to cover this facility. And so from there, we started a coalition called Texans United for Families to draw attention to what was happening at Hutto and in the detention and deportation system, and really launched what became a multi-year national campaign to end the practice of detaining immigrant families. It involved dozens of vigils, and many people in this room attended these vigils at the facility to draw attention. It included litigation. The University of Texas and the ACLU sued Immigration and Customs Enforcement and claiming that there were unconstitutional conditions for confining children at the facility. It included a lot of media attention, including 2 documentary films that were made about the Teton Hutto Detention Center. A short film called Hutto, America's Family Prison, which was actually the last time I was here at a public affairs forum. We showed that film over in the other room. And a feature-length film called The Least of These that debuted at South by Southwest in 2009. And all of this culminated with the election of Obama in 2008, and we did are we at time? Okay. Okay, yeah, absolutely. All of this culminated in 2009 when the Obama administration came into power, and we did 100 different actions in the first 100 days of the Obama administration around the country. And it culminated in August of 2009 with the first Obama announcement on detention, which included basically the immediate ending of family detention at the facility. The facility remains open. It's a all-women's immigration detention facility now. So this is a video, and maybe I won't show it in the interest of time, but if you're one of the other strategies that I think is very hopeful is the growth of visitation programs around the country. In 2010, we started the Hutto Visitation Program, and Peggy and several folks from this church have been involved in that, very involved, where we send people out to visit women who are detained at the Teton Hutto Detention Center in order to both break the isolation of detention for those people who are detained, but also to be monitoring human rights violations and to be building a community of people outside of detention centers who know what's going on and care about the people who are detained there and are advocating for changes to the detention and deportation system. And then I think another very interesting and inspiring movement that has sprung up around the country, particularly in the last couple of years, is the pressure on states and local governments to end their participation in deportation programs, particularly secure communities, right? Which is a program that I talked about earlier that is funneling tens of thousands of people into detention and deportation proceedings. What you see is a picture of a civil disobedience that happened here in Austin a few weeks ago, where 6 people sat down in front of the doors of the jail where the deportation buses exit. And progressive communities around the country have entered into agreements or passed agreements that severely limit ICE's ability to access people in their jails. Just yesterday, we had a candidate forum. More than 200 people showed up to tell the candidates for county judge and county commission precinct 2 that they want Austin, they want Travis County to join progressive communities around the country in stopping the deportations from our community and stopping the 19 deportations that happen every week here in Travis County. 19 deportations a week. from happening here in Travis County anymore. Just one other thing that people are doing around the country is divestment, including congregations and churches are figuring out if their money is involved in the private prison industry in any way and taking it out, passing screens. The entire United Methodist Church has added divestment of private prisons to one of the several things, including weapons and tobacco, that they will no longer invest in. So I am more hopeful than I have been in a long time about where we are as a movement. I certainly encourage people to get involved. I have a sign-up sheet at the end of the table here. Particularly, I think the faith community plays an enormous role in being a conscience on all of this. And as we gear up to end the deportations from Travis County, I think that people in the faith community are going to play a critically important role in making that happen. So thank you very much.
And now we'll take questions. Would you raise your hand high? Greg.
My name's Greg Markley, and my background, as people are here, I guess are going to hear a repeat of, is in criminal justice. I, in fact, tried to get a job with the Obama administration as the director of the National Institute of Corrections, which is buried within the Bureau of Prisons. So there's a question here. One of the questions is, every budget cycle, almost, the Bureau of Prisons tries to redline the National Institute of Corrections, which works with the states on the alternatives. Secondly, the Bureau of Prisons has been under legislative mandate for a decade or more to reduce their prison population and develop alternative treatment programs. To date, they have not done that at all. So the first question is, what could be done about that? It's well documented. The second question is, when the sheriff's departments around the country, when their main source of income now comes from detainees, how do you change that? When the whole funding structure has been altered such that it's in their best interest to have people in detention.
Thank you, Greg.
Yeah, I mean, I think on the first question about the federal government's budget for prisons, I mean, one of the things that we've tried to do is really draw into question the continued funding for these car contract facilities. And I'm actually not an expert on the entire Bureau of Prisons budget system, but one thing that has happened is that there continues to be funding of these car contract facilities. And actually, in the last budget cycle, right, they actually, where we've had a continuing resolution for several years, but in the last budget that was actually passed, they funded an additional one of these car contract facilities. And there's another one that there's a solicitation out for. So I think that, you know, one of the things that we've tried to do is really draw a juxtaposition between the public statements of the Obama administration on reducing the number of low-level people convicted of drug offenses, with this increased prosecution of immigrants. And, you know, I know that the NIC's recommendations are not often, you know, a forefront in the budget. On the question about county jails and incentives to detain people, there's kind of two different things that happen. One is that a lot of county jails actually rent out their beds to ICE, right, and make money doing detaining people that way, right? So they're actually people in immigration custody, and ICE is paying the jail to detain them there. That's not what's happening in Travis County. What's happening in Travis County is that the sheriff is allowing ICE to put detainers on people who are still in the sheriff's custody. Now, some of that cost is reimbursed through a federal program called SCAP, but most of it is not. And so we're actually spending, we estimate, between $1 million and $2 million a year to subsidize this federal program of detaining people in the county jail. So we're spending more than $1 million of Travis County taxpayer money to help deport 19 people a week from our community. And so I think that that's actually one of the strongest arguments, particularly for the county commission, because the county commission, you know, in Texas, the sheriff has control over the jail based on his constitutional authority, but the county commission has control over the budget. And so, you know, county commissioners and county commission candidates have been increasingly talking about using the power of the purse to stop this program.
We have a question here. Would you say your name, please?
Maria Salas. Thank you, Bob. I'm with the Amigos, the huddle, and I have heard incredible, stories from the women detained there. But my question today has to do with every day I meet people that are illegal, and are undocumented, really the alien word. I hope it goes with the N word sometime. So my question is, this worker in my house, he is from Honduras. He's undocumented, and yesterday his sister crossed the border, and he literally told me that she was thrown at the bridge, tirada a la calle, with her, they crossed her, so she was dropped so that she would be picked up by immigration because she's coming with her son, 14-year-old, and she was told that they will not detain her for very long. He's going to give his name when they call him, and he asked me if I would do the same. So my question is, when you hear that, what can I do? Should I,
Yeah, I am not a lawyer, and I think that I would consult a lawyer, right, an immigration lawyer, to figure out where they are in their, in immigration proceedings, because in addition to it being very heartbreaking, these stories are also very complicated legally. And so, as you know, one of the things that the Amigos de Hutto, right, the Hutto Visitation Program does is, provide support, but not legal support for the people who are detained there, because the cases are very complicated. Immigration law is very complicated, and so I wouldn't want to provide any bad advice. So, but I can certainly connect you with people who can provide that advice.
We have a question from Ken Coyne.
Bob, thank you for being here.
I can.
My question is, just how many of the private prisons have immigration courts right inside? Pearsall does.
Yes. Several immigration detention facilities have built immigration courts right inside of the facilities. And then additionally, a lot of them have video technology, which is actually can be very complicating for people who are in immigration proceedings, because either they and their attorney, if they have one, are in their detention facility, and then the judge is somewhere else, or the lawyer is with the judge and they're in their in the detention facility. So I don't know like what the percentage is, but I do know that there are others. I know that the Willacy County facility had courts in it. It's now no longer an immigration detention facility, the one in Raymondville. It's now a criminal alien requirement contract facility with the Bureau of Prisons. But there are others, but not all of them for sure.
We have a question here. Would you stand and say your name, please?
Hello, my name is Bernice Hecker. These contracts that say 34,000 prisoners, but actually, don't they just want the money? They don't need the bodies. You would think that they would just not want to have as few prisoners as possible, as long as they're getting the 34,000 money for it. Is that true, or?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the contracts are built are per diem contracts, right? So right. I think that from the incarceration perspective, from a justice perspective, we would want, even if we were paying for those beds, we would still want fewer people in them. I think that what becomes complicated is that when government agencies are spending money to detain, say, 34,000 people, then there is pressure, including political pressure from members of the House of Congress, to make sure those beds are full. And so the number of people who were detained in immigration custody actually was above that 34,000 number when the sequester hit, and ICE released, like 1,000 people, right, or something like that. And members of Congress, House of Representatives, including some from the Austin area, went nuts, like sent out press releases saying ICE was releasing dangerous criminals into the community, the sort of fear-mongering that often happens. And so I think that what that bed mandate does is really provide a lot of pressure for politicians to keep those beds full and for the agency to keep those beds full so that they don't get that political heat.
Yeah. We have a question from Fred Higgins.
Yes, Bob. As I sit here listening, and I've been trying to inform myself for several weeks or months about what's going on, but what I sense you are doing and people that work with you is very important work. You're trying to mitigate the pain or the symptoms of a system that is busted, and I'm wondering, could you just quickly, and maybe this is too general a question, but what is the ultimate solution here?
Well, right. I mean, that is a big question. I mean, I don't think that we should build our immigration policy around a system of enforcement, right? I don't think that we should build it around the presumption that when people are coming, they should be detained and deported, right? I think that we should build it in a completely different way, right, that where there is orderly immigration, right, but where the presumption is not to keep people out, right, but to figure out how to integrate people in. That's really big, right, and what that actually looks like. But I think that, one of the things I didn't say is we now spend more money on immigration enforcement than all other federal law enforcement combined, right, than the FBI, than the DEA, than the ATF combined, right? How does that make sense? That doesn't make any sense that we're spending all this money and destroying hundreds of thousands of people's lives. And so you're right. I think that we've even, in many ways, the idea of a comprehensive immigration reform bill, right, has been thrown out for this legislative session. The Republicans have said they're not going to bring it up in the House. And even the bill that passed the Senate included massive increases in border militarization and increases in detention and incarceration of immigrants. So I think that I do think that we are at a moment where we're challenging those really harsh enforcement policies. But what I think is hopeful about this moment is that because these policies have affected so many people in the immigrant community and people who are close to the immigrant community, that there's becoming a critical mass of people who are concerned about this. And the fact that there are cities across the country and counties and states across the country that are forcefully opting out of these policies, I think shows that the momentum is with us. So.
And we have materials from Bob at the back by the baskets and on the table, so consider picking up some of those as you go. We have time for one last question from John Franks.
Hi, Bob. This is partly a comment, and I don't know if this has occurred in other cases, but in Philadelphia there were two judges that got sent to prison for kids for cash. They were basically taking money from the prison to put kids in prison, from the prison builders to put kids in prison. And I'm not sure if that kind of incentive happens with the undocumented as well, but it's just another sign of how messed up our prison system is right now.
Yeah, and I want to believe that was probably not the norm, right? This was illegal bribes, right? That a small prison company in Pennsylvania was giving to a juvenile judge in order to have them sentence people for low-level offenses. I think on that level, I hope that that's not happening, but I think on the grander scheme, right, what we have is private prison corporations who they say they never lobby on issues related to immigration enforcement or sentencing policies, but where they do, almost every lobbying disclosure form that they file says that they lobby on appropriations. And it's in appropriations is where the bed mandate comes from. So I think on a much grander scheme, private prison corporations are all over the place influencing this policy and the big policy of detaining 34,000 people unnecessarily every day.
We have just about probably 3 or 4 minutes left, and I want to ask you to maybe make a closing statement. But as we've listened, I think I'm struck by how difficult it is to regulate the treatment of the people in these prisons. And I guess I have a question. Are there any other agencies or groups that are attempting to establish minimum standards for health care, nutrition, exercise, access to legal services, etc.?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a national network of organizations that is concerned with immigration detention called the Detention Watch Network. That is organizations like ours that are advocacy and organizing groups, that is organizations of directly affected people, people who are formerly detained or their family members, that include legal service providers. So here in Austin, there's a great legal service organization called American Gateways, formerly the Political Asylum Project of Austin, that goes out to Hutto every week and does Know Your Rights trainings. There are faith organizations around the country who are engaged in a myriad of different ways. There are visitation programs. So I think that there are lots of ways to get plugged into these kind of campaigns on a lot of different levels. I also think that here in Austin right now, there's really an enormous amount of work that's being done on these issues. We work very closely in the campaign to stop the deportations with the Austin Immigrant Rights Coalition, with the Texas Civil Rights Project, with the Workers' Defense Project. There's a whole host of organizations that are fighting for immigrant justice on one level or another. And I think that we work very closely also with the University Leadership Initiative, which is a group of DREAM Act eligible University of Texas students, so undocumented students who are terrific advocates and very, very well organized. So I really think that right now in Austin there's a growing movement of many different organizations, and I'm very hopeful that we're not even going to have to wait till January to stop the deportations from Travis County, that we'll get this thing done in the next year, and I hope that all of you will help be a part of that.
Well, we certainly want to support you in continuing your social justice work in this arena. Thank you so much for coming and talking with us.